Fredrick Douglas National Historic Site.
That's not 85 steps.
That was in the front.
That's pretty much the state of Maryland. That's where Mr. Douglas started out, began his life on a plantation in Talbot County, Maryland. And he would make that transition from slavery to freedom at the age of 20, pretty much with the help of or aid of his first wife, Miss Anna Murray Douglas, who allowed or helped him or aided him in his quest to become his own master, as he often would say. The home sits right in the middle, very fittingly and symbolically. But if you look over to your left, as you guys were coming up those steps, well, I think you guys came up those set of steps. But if you make your way back down, you'll see the actual Capitol. And that's where Mr. Douglas pretty much had two connections to that Capitol. He was, first of all, the first African-American to be allowed in the press gallery as a corresponding editor. And then it sort of comes full circle because we're back to the home. When Mr. Douglas purchased this home in 1877, he had been appointed the United States Marshal of the District of Columbia. And one of the actual duties of the actual United States Marshal, not only being the chief law enforcement agent or officer, he actually acted as a domestic ambassador, taking tours with foreign dignitaries to the White House as well as the Capitol. So this skyline here really is fitting in terms of Mr. Douglas's transition from slavery to freedom. On behalf of the National Park Service, we ask you guys to help us preserve and conserve the objects that you're about to see throughout the home by not touching any of the objects. The oils from your hands will pretty much deteriorate the objects. And that leads to the next question, that many of these objects that you're going to see exhibited throughout the house are original. We have about 70% of the original artifacts on display here, and then many of them are actually at our Museum Resource Center in Landover, Maryland. And you're pretty much in store for a treat because it's pretty much a time capsule, as if Mr. Douglas was still living here. So if Mr. Douglas were to rise from the grave today, he'll pretty much feel right at home, particularly on the first floor of the actual home. That leads to the next question. When Mr. Douglas purchased the home, he actually purchased it for $6,700. It really gives you a true indication of his wealth at the time. I think when he passed away, his estate pretty much amounted to about $100,000. Back during that time, that would have been multi-millions. So it's extremely cold in here, but you know, but it's a good thing because our HVAC system has been out of whack. Because you know, this modern technology is just not conducive to this old 19th century structure. So we're going to start here in the hallway and end here in the hallway.
Oh, it's nice.
Wonderful. Thank you.
How do I do this without my flash? Mine, there should be from the
Before we get started, I'd like to always point out, we've talked about sort of the skyline being sort of a metaphor of Mr. Douglas's life, but many of the objects that you're going to see throughout the home really gives us a true indication that Mr. Douglas was indeed this conscious collector. He was always sort of trying to sort of re-mold himself. This was a 15-acre sprawling estate. We'll always jokingly say that this was pretty much Mr. Douglas's rustic rural oasis, basically escaping from sort of the drudgeries of the everyday sort of going-ons in the deeper section of the city, because the District of Columbia was known as a cesspool during that period. And Mr. Douglas purchased this home for many reasons, but one was it actually resembled the home in Rochester. Mr. Douglas lived in Rochester for about 30-something odd years, and if you go to Rochester today, that home no longer exists, the structure itself, but it actually, the plot, the land where it existed, it actually overlooks the actual city of Rochester, just like this home. And it's often been described as a neighborless place. So Mr. Douglas used it pretty much as a sort of pit stop on the Underground Railroad when he was living in Rochester. But Mr. Douglas did love rural and rustic area. He was a naturalist in many ways. A normal day for Mr. Douglas was getting up about 5 o'clock in the morning, walking the 15-acre ground estate with his large English Mastiff dog named Frank. He would lift weights out here on the front lawn. And then we do have excellent photographs between sort of the 1890s of some gymnast rings actually hanging out here on the actual front porch. And we suspect that he was doing early forms of pull-ups as well. he was definitely known as a Victorian gentleman. I say that in many ways. Before we get started, if you sort of just sort of take a look to your left or right, and really, what is the perception, so your beginning perception or initial perception of Mr. Douglas to now as seeing these two parlors here? So how has your perception of Mr. Douglas changed?
Very organized,
Exactly. Exactly. So, and those were some of the many things that he wanted you to take away if you came to visit him. And we learn a lot through individuals, through their art collections, through their music collection, as well as the objects that are situated inside their home. And so, Mr. Douglas wanted you to walk away from that. I mean, if you didn't know Mr. Douglas's story, you would have known that you would never know that he was an enslaved person. So this Victorian mansion actually does take Mr. Douglas himself, and he probably would have ushered you here into the actual east part. So let's step on in here, not knowing him on a personal level. You can sort of squeeze, everybody squeeze on into your book. The gentleman that would have greeted you in a cordial fashion, either at the door or coming out of this study, if you guys take a look over here in the fireplace mirror over the mantle here, you'll see a nice oil painting beaming right at you. So that pretty much is Mr. Douglas' appearance while he lived here inside the home. And so he's come out and greeted you guys in a cordial fashion, probably have you guys sit down and play a game of checkers in these seats here, probably crank the music box. Discuss many leading issues of the day. I've probably talked about some of his experiences growing up in the United States. But if you were here by yourself, more likely he probably would have offered you to come on into his study or library here. So I'll let you guys take a look in his study, and then we'll sort of, if you guys have any questions about any of the pictures or portraits or objects, you can feel free to ask.
That right there, yeah, down below, that
Yes.
circular, what is that made from?
It's actually made out of wood. And
Okay.
it's actually, and it sort of touches on the themes of what Mr. Douglas really wanted to sort of have his visitors sort of take away when they came and visit here was his love of nature. This is actually sort of actual cows pasturing on a rural area. And a lot of the actual themes that you're going to see in the actual paintings is this rural pastoral type of a motif. Yeah.
We came from Mount Vernon, and George Washington had a commissioned painting very similar in theme to that one.
Okay.
Does anybody remember the picture that he had? I remember because it was so dark and it was stormy. And do you know anything about that picture?
Well, we're not really sure. It's unknown artist, but we do know that Mr. Douglas really always highlighted the true embodiment of freedom was the actual sea, because it would let ships go and pass as they may. And and then you can also, it probably also is another theme of his love of Alexander Dumas, who actually wrote Count of Monte Cristo.
Count of Monte Cristo, yeah.
And so that is sort of the old castle where Napoleon was actually held captive, and the major, major setting, the first couple scenes of the actual book. And but we suspect, we're still trying to track down who the actual artist was. We suspect it was an African American artist. But we're not sure, so we're trying to track that down. But speaking of Mount Vernon, Mr. Douglas and his second wife, Miss Helen Pitts Douglas, often go to Mount Vernon. That's probably one of the reasons why the home still exists today, because Mr. Douglas, just like George Washington foresaw his legacy.
Yes,
So,
yes.
And speaking of Mr. Douglas's loved ones and wives, Mr. Douglas did have two wives over the course of his life. His first wife is Miss Anna Marie Douglas. We talked about her. Actually, she was actually a free person of color, so we jokingly say that Mr. Douglas married up. She actually helped Mr. Douglas escape from slavery. You guys will see that reinforced in the film. But Mr. Douglas remarried in 1884 after Miss Anna Marie Douglas passed away here inside her room in 1882 to Miss Helen Pitts Douglas there. She was white, and that created a social controversy in many ways. You did have a lot of Southern senators trying to outlaw the interracial marriage and dating here in the actual District of Columbia during that time period. A lot of satire and sort of negative media that they received. You can go back and do some research. One interesting Southern newspaper said that Mr. Douglas marrying Miss Helen Pitts Douglas became an African nefarious Solomon. And then you also had African Americans actually sort of quote-unquote disowning Mr. Douglas because of the interracial marriage. And basically they said that on this day at this time, because of the nature of this marriage being interracial, we're going to take Mr. Douglas's portraits off our walls and put them in our stables. So they pretty much received grief from both sides. So you guys can take a look in his study. A lot of original objects exhibited here. This derby hat, which is made out of excellent material and textile, but the actual top hat there is actually made out of sealskin. And speaking of the notions of theme and of freedom and liberty, the actual chair that you see there is actually one of the original chairs in the House of Representatives dating all back to 1857. You'll see in its crest the American flag. That is Blanche Gelso Bruce. He was interesting enough. He actually was the first African American to serve a full term in the Senate during Reconstruction. We did not have another African American serve in the Senate until 1962. And then you had Caroline Bond, and Barack Obama. And he was a frequent guest here. He was Mr. Douglas's best man at a second grade as well as a ball. You'll notice the patterns of the wallpaper. The wallpaper that you're going to see throughout the home is areas where the original pattern. Like the border here, this is west part of it. So it is actually the original pattern. And you'll see a lot of floral and flowers all throughout the furnishings that go with the wallpaper. So this captures Mr. Douglas's last over. That's tiny of that. The Victoria gentleman, what he's like we actually took up the Victoria. That's actually a hat receiver. So it was a Victorian faux pas to touch anybody's hat with your hand. So that would be extended out to you to actually place your hat on there. That would have been in the hallway along with his many canes there. Yep.
That's interesting. Hat receiver. Receiver.
It's unbelievable that he achieved such a status when equal to other great men, but he had so much more to overcome.
Exactly.
You know, it sort of makes him, in a way, better than
Yeah,
anyone.
he was the true embodiment of American exception.
It's unbelievable.
You guys come on down. We're going to switch our attention over to the West Parlor here, which is the informal living room. So this is where Mr. Douglas would entertain his guests from the likes of his grandkids. Miss Harriet Tubman, Susan B. Anthony would be guests here. And then he would often give his grandkids piggyback rides on this floor down here. And another interesting symbolic symbol is the tie back, pulling back the curtains. You see a ball and chain. Constant reminder of Mr. Douglas, a former enslavement here. This Kimball piano is original. This was played by many individuals.
I have a Kimball.
The violin that you see here was actually a reproduction of a Stradivarius violin once belonged to his grandson Joseph. When Mr. Douglas gave Joseph his first lessons on the violin at the age of 12. And Mr. Douglas was self-taught violin.
How many children did he have?
He had a total of 5. 3 sons, 2 daughters. Unfortunately, his youngest daughter, Annie.
Yeah.
As you guys come on down, we're going to try to fit all into the dining room. This is the largest room of the home here. And Mr. Douglas often sat at this table. He was known to be very animated at the table. If you notice, this chair has wheels on it and armrests on it, and the spindles in the back there, very Victorian of the time. And he would often get up, mock and mimic people, chase his grandkids around the table. We often know that he would, as I said, not only give them piggyback rides, but he would play wheelbarrow with them all throughout the time. And the play settings that you see are from France, collected on his travels there. We have an interesting napkin ring here. Actually, it's inscribed with Miss Helen Pitts Douglas's name in it. I don't have my gloves, I can't pick it up and show you. But the actual utensils that you see here are all original. The chairs that you see assembled around the table actually could have been used to accommodate large guests. We do know that there were 2 leaves that were often placed here in the actual table. And Mr. Douglas entertained people from all walks of life. As I stated earlier, he would have Susan B. Anthony, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Harriet Tubman, and famous journalist T. Thomas Fortune, Mary Turch Terrell, Ida B. Wells, and often on Sundays, we do know that, according to his diaries, he often would have students from Howard University over for Sunday tea and then play croquet with them out in the backyard. And the photograph that you see above the fireplace is an interesting one because it's Mr. Douglas standing with other distinguished gentlemen of the President Benjamin Harrison Inaugural Committee. And what you have here is Mr. Douglas being appointed the United States Minister to Haiti at the time, what we deem as the ambassador. And so that really reflects how many presidents Mr. Douglas had the ear of, beginning with President Lincoln, ending in 1890 with President Benjamin Harrison. But one governmental appointment tends to get glossed over, which is the recorder of deeds. If you think about deeds, what do you think about? Property, right? So here's a man that started out as somebody's property, and then outside of the establishment, then making that transition from slavery to freedom, sort of embodying the American ideal and actually willing and deeding out property. So at the tail end of his life. Original place settings here in the butler's pantry closet. And the additions to the home actually is from this point on back. Mr. Douglas began to add on to the home as soon as he purchased it in 1877. And we're going to step into the pantry. Yeah, the ice box is actually purchased from Sears and Roebuck.
I don't think I'm going to dissolve
Deserves.
tonight.
I'm cracking. I'm thinking at you.
I thought about it.
You know, I'm talking about like with your kids and stuff. You know how you set ice cream maker?
Oh, yeah.
You can't own it.
You can't, exactly. That's a good way to put it. You can't own it, don't touch it.
Well, it's true because it sales. If you want someone to buy something, you want them to touch it and make it their own. So it's different.
I never saw a pump like that.
Ooh, I haven't either.
Turn it.
That's interesting.
I guess it'd be easier than.
It would.
Crank it.
I love.
You're okay.
Well,
No, you're fine.
I love the eyes.
Yeah.
Those of you that didn't get your laundry done last night, there's 2 machines available.
Let's step right here all into
No
the
quarters required.
Okay.
laundry room here.
It's just like little dominoes.
So did he do his own laundry? Oh,
You know what? Probably not.
No.
He was a man. in the Victorian era.
But what's interesting, speaking of laundry, we do know that, Mr. Douglas made most of his money giving lectures and speeches, so that required him to be on the road a lot. And we do know that we suspect even both of his wives, but particularly Miss Anna Marie Douglas, they did have a sort of a regimen where he would actually, either as he's coming through the city, she would actually throw him a bundle of new fresh linen and clothing items, or she would actually often sort of forward it to the next hotel he's actually staying at. So. And we suspect Miss Helen Pitts Douglas did the same as well. You got the rug beater, which was the vacuum cleaner of the day. Having these rooms attached to the home really seems, in a subtle way to us, that seems old and archaic, but having these rooms attached to the home really demonstrated how modern the home was. Having the kitchen, the laundry room, and the catch-all room, as well as the pantry attached to the home, really demonstrated modernity and how wealthy Mr. Douglas was.
Right.
High ceilings here. Mr. Douglas often would enter through the back door, and the driveway that you guys see today, or walked on, is actually the original pattern. You did have sort of a bridge. The steps that you walked up, those are the same pattern of the steps and arm railings and everything. So as you come up there, but that's where the carriage would actually meet Mr. Douglas. It would come down, and either Mr. Douglas would walk up those steps, or it would take him up to the back. He did have several different outbuildings. He did have a outhouse or a privy. He had his man cave, which was the growlery, the stone-looking building on the far south of the actual property there. Then you had the carriage house, chicken coop, and several different hammocks all throughout here, as well as benches. And we have a lot of recorded, sort of recorded events here at the site. Particularly, a lot of journalists would come and sort of interview Mr. Douglas either in his study or out here on the actual property here and playing croquet out in the back. And you got the clothing boiler here, several different irons. You can see how they progressed and evolved over time. Those would have been placed on a potbelly stove such as this, but then you had sort of modern stoves, the flute ruffling iron in the middle, we put ruffles in lady shirts.
Oh,
Then you
wow.
have the actual kerosene or steam iron there, and then the coal burning iron there. We're going to transition, since we're an exceptionally large group, we're going to just let you guys sort of follow the rug all the way up to the top. We're going to stop into the trunk room, and then if you have any questions about any of the objects here in the kitchen, I'll be glad to discuss them with you. But what you're going to see as you come through, you're going to see a coal burning stove, which was very modern at its time. Some of the cooking utensils that were used to prepare meals, and then you're going to see a dry sink. And then the actual cistern, Mr. Douglas did have the water source inside the home. The old creaking stream actually used to run through the property. I don't know, did you guys come up the driveway?
Yeah.
But all the way down to Visitor Center parking lot is where the creaking stream used to be. But the cistern here was actually, which collected rainwater, and it was a device on the top that would funnel water from the roof down into a trough.
So, did Fredrick Douglass himself have servants?
Yeah, he did have paid caretakers, usually often the friends of the family. And we do know they had a doorman, stagecoach driver by the name of York, and then an older lady. Basically, we suspect that was his daughter's sister-in-law, who actually worked on and off for them for a time period, about 17 years. And she actually resigned out of the protest of the interracial marriage, the second marriage. So
She was in protest of it?
Yeah.
He got it from both sides.
Exactly. Yep.
Not a man to shy away from controversy.
Here's my phone. There it is.
And this is where Mr. Douglas, but as you can see, places traveling trunks or steamer trunks here. And one particular trunk that we often like to point out is the one to your right, the green and leather one.
With his name on
And
it?
yeah, with F. Douglas and stripes, and that's the one he often would travel with, which is fascinating within his own right, because here's a man that started out on a plantation, and he would domestically and internationally travel throughout the world. And I think during the 2008, the State Department listed some sort of trends or statistics about how many people actually traveled, how many people own a passport. And not too many of Americans actually own a passport or travel extensively. So here's a man that sort of went beyond sort of the confines or bounds of his life to actually
Beyond
travel
his
throughout the
borders.
world. Exactly, exactly. He said that, he often said that, or often said that human beings pretty much are traveling beings, and that's how you pretty much enhance, your worldview, is through travel. And this room here was actually used by the grandkids. That was the grandkids' room here, and it's connected to the ladies' guest chamber, but particularly by the name, a grandson by the name of Haley George, who often would occupy this space. And he considered this first and foremost to be his room. We discovered letters of him actually petitioning his cousins to be kicked out of his room. And the chamber pots that you see are, the bathrooms of its time. So every room does technically have a bathroom, but not to our standards today. So the outhouse or the privy are what we deem as a porta
What
potty.
about the floor mats?
The floor mats, that's actually made out of sort of a bamboo wicker type of material, and these are original. Yeah, and yeah, so you can see it's pretty much the environment is taking its toll on them. So we're trying to. That's what we're trying to do, is actually track down some replicas and see if we can find some.
I would think that this wouldn't be from the area, this would be from his travels as well.
Exactly,
Like the
exactly. A lot of the furnishings that you see, you're going to see sort of that sort of Caribbean or
Right, that's what I thought when I saw that.
yeah. And that even, believe it or not, the cistern, the water source, having that water source inside the home is sort of a West Indian Caribbean type of idea. And the closets, and that's fascinating too. Having the closets on this side really demonstrated how modern the home was, because Mr. Douglas did add closets on this section of the home. When you go down this way, which makes up the original structure, you're going to actually notice that they didn't have any closets, but you're going to have detached closets, the shiffer rows or armoires. Yeah. All right. So that's a linen closet there. Yeah. So you guys can transition on down. Matter of fact, since we don't bottleneck right here, just go all the way down to the bay window and we'll work our way back.
We lived in Mishawaka and Revere Boy.
Nettie Washington, and then we moved up to Grange for the
I delivered pizzas to Judy Creek. Much better tasting wallpaper.
And the other one just moved it out. She moved out. Just had a boyfriend, we get a house. I hate that.
This house is a lot bigger than it appears on the outside.
God, look at the size of it.
The wallpaper is a lot more tasteful than some of the historic homes we've been in.
No, but
Just really want to start. We're gonna live.
Now on the main floor, so these pictures were actually taken in 1895. So these are the original photographs that we used to pinpoint how objects were supposed to be situated, and sort of really make this home really come alive to our visitors. So this is actually the east parlor, the first room that we stepped into. We talked about the border here. You guys saw the rocking chair, and you saw several different Greek busts and statues there. And remember, you asked about the actual plate here, and the actual painting. And interesting enough, you did one of my favorite photographs is Mr. Douglas sitting at that chair. That same chair. For those that didn't hear, that chair is actually one of the original chairs from the House of Representatives, dating back to 1857. And we talked about Mr. Douglas's trusted companion, Frank. He's actually is laying down right here. You saw the derby hat there. And we talked about Mr. Douglas's love of nature and the flower vase here, as well as the violin and same peacock feathers down there. And you can see his bookshelves are pretty much littered with books. A lot of his books are being conserved on an off-site there, being sort of cataloged. And exactly. The actual books probably cost more than the home at the time. So. And even right now, you know. So. And then last but not least, the informal living room. He engages grandkids with piggyback rides and history lessons there, playing the violin. Once again, the border. And you'll see Mr. Woodrow Phillips on the easel there, ball and chain. If you take a look to your left or right, take a look at the wallpaper pattern and take a look at the pattern here.
how is it that so much of his estate was preserved?
Excellent question. Immediately after Mr. Douglas passed away, Miss Helen Pitts Douglas established the Fredrick Douglas Memorial and Historical Association, and they were going to pretty much partner with the National Association of Color Women's Clubs. They would actually be the preservationists and stewardess of the home all until 1962. So they would pretty much hold all the objects. I'm pretty sure many of the objects probably did become missing, you know, over the years, but we able to actually, you know, display about 70% of the original objects here inside the home. So that says a lot, you know, compared to other historic sites. And so they held the actual home together until they turned everything over to the National Park Service in 1962.
Was that at her death, his wife's death, it was turned over?
Yeah, matter of fact, she passed away here inside the home in 1903, and then she will and needed everything over to the National Association of Color Women's Clubs. But those organizations pretty much merged, and she did say that she wanted this to be sort of the Mount Vernon of the color people, right?
You know, it's really wonderful. It shows the television for her to have his legacy to be shared.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. And we suspect they probably had those conversations going, you know, sort of traveling over to Mount Vernon. So. And as you come up, I know somebody mentioned about sort of it's nice to have two sets of steps. So you have the informal set of steps that we came up. We're going to go down the formal set of steps, but those steps lead into the trunk room, as I stated earlier. But what you have is the home divided down Victorian lines upstairs. So you have the formal and informal downstairs. So what makes up the formal makes up the gentleman's side upstairs, which would be to your left. And then so the room on the left here is actually the male's guest chamber, which is connected to Mr. Douglas's room. Then as you come up, we talked about the grandkids room, and we said that it was connected to the ladies' guest chamber. So this is the gentle ladies' side. So the ladies' guest chamber is connected to Miss Anna Marie Douglas's room. So she would actually pass away in this room in 1882, and everything was taken out, roped off, and nobody could actually enter this room. Before passing away officially, she actually suffered from her first stroke, which led her to be paralyzed from the waist down. So you'll see an invalid chair in the far corner, which is the early forms of a wheelchair. And then in 1884, Mr. Douglas would remarry to Miss Helen Pitts Douglas, and this is her room here. And you'll see her shoes, her hairpins, and you guys see the laptop in the room?
So that was his room and that was her room, so they had separate
bedrooms, and that was very Victorian, but it also was another sign of wealth and affluency. And being a conservative time period, you wanted to show the sort of, gentlemen and women wanted to show the self-decorum and self-control, which was very fitting because if you think about it, if you go back and look at newspaper accounts, African-American males were pretty much being deemed as sort of rapists and beastly. So here's a man that sort of defied that and overturned that whole notion of, sort of stereotypes. And what's interesting is in Mr. Douglas's room, you'll see his shoes, his Panama hat, as well as his vest. And those are the same items that he's actually wearing on his travels to Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic. So the shoes that you see there, and so those items that were back to 1871. And this was, this home here outside from the district, section of the city, so and district, so we're outside of the city. Yep.
Can you tell us about how Mr. Douglas died?
Oh, I'll tell you that. Excellent question. That we cool.
Oh, okay.
Any questions? And sort of transition into servants' court out here on the property.
Do you think he was aware of his place in history, like a lot of the other founding fathers?
Oh, of course, of course. I mean, that's what he spent. I mean, he spent his life sort of molding and shaping his legacy. Matter of fact, if you notice the artwork, pretty much Mr. Douglas was a true proponent. Immediately after the Civil War, he wanted the formerly enslaved people to actually begin to collect art to try to sort of reshape their image. So he was definitely another interesting thing. I mean, that's a good question because that leads to another interesting thing about Mr. Douglas in terms of. I don't want to say he was a narcissist, but he was very aware of his presence. And a lot of accounts have been sort of written about him actually entering rooms and the presence that he had. But when he lived in Rochester, we do know that he actually purposely purchased a white horse, and he would actually parade the horse down Main Street of Rochester. So,
well, there had to be a little bit of that in-your-face business. I mean, a little bit.
oh yeah,
That's
he
just
was often attacked, and he would sort of brazenly walk arm in arm with white women down the street.
Yeah,
he was attacked.
So how much of that can you take? Yeah. But did he also have conversations with his grandchildren about their carrying on?
Oh yeah,
started? Because I mean that would be one of the greatest gifts.
Yeah, basically, and a lot of his kids, he had already started with his kids. They pretty much. Was carrying on his legacy. They worked with him intimately with the newspaper ventures. That was one of the reasons why Mr. Douglas did move to the District of Columbia. They started as a corresponding editor. He was living in Rochester, but then he actually started his last newspaper venture, which was the New National Era. Okay. And that would pretty much, he would turn it over to his sons when he became...
Garrett
Smith. Garrett Smith is an interesting character. He was actually a good friend of Mr. Douglas. Matter of fact, a lot of historians would argue that's one of the reasons why Mr. Douglas moved to Rochester. He was convinced by Garrett Smith. He was a large landowner in upstate New York. He learned, basically had tremendous plots of land. He actually, I think, gave Mr. Douglas some land. He also was a chief investor in his North Star newspaper.
Okay, because he gave him the picture.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And what's fascinating is, speaking of that, if you notice, here's a man, even, people that ran in those circles were pretty much way ahead of their time. How many, what would they ever thought, littering the actual walls of, Susan B. Anthony, Harry Beecher Stowe, Garrett Smith, and Mr. Douglas. If you notice, it's an interracial type of
Right.
photograph collection, right?
So he's very much an integrationist.
Exactly.
And the story that we saw at Lincoln said, they had not allowed any African Americans into Lincoln's inauguration, and then Lincoln said, here's my good friend, and so that must have been a great triumph for him. Yeah.
Yep. And they just had an excellent play on the interaction between Mr. Lincoln, President Lincoln, as well as Mr. Douglas. And Mr. Douglas did advise him on many occasions, particularly 2 or 3. We know for a fact he was actually offered or invited out to the soldiers' home, but I think their schedules conflicted, so he wasn't able to come. But that's an interesting site as well. So we always call that the Camp David of its time.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to transition down these formal set of steps, and we'll conclude on February 20th, 1895, after suffering a massive heart attack. We suspect also a stroke. He went to a women's council meeting early that day at Meserat Hall. Usually, Ms. Helen Pitts Douglas would accompany Mr. Douglas, to his meetings, but ironically, she actually was doing research at the Library of Congress that day. So basically, he was discussing what transpired at that actual meeting, and then he would, as he was making his way out to go off to another speaking engagement, a local speaking engagement at a local church, and he just collapsed right here as he was sort of acting out some of the actual speeches that were given. And he's actually buried in Rochester, New York, in the Section A section of Mount Hope Cemetery. And there's a family burial plot. The only, I think 2 of his sons are not buried with him. Actually, they're buried in a burial plot in Landover, Maryland. And both of his wives, his youngest daughter Annie, and his oldest daughter Rosetta, actually are buried with him.
How old was he?
He was 77 years old, so which was really good at that time.
Does he have his sons now?
Yes, he
Still
does.
alive? Doing what?
Yes, he does. He has a sort of great nieces and nephews, and a great granddaughter, Nettie Washington Douglas, and her son Kenneth. Those are the 2 descendants that we know of, and they come here from time to time. Matter of fact, maybe in the last 3 months, Miss Nettie Washington Douglas came. She's the granddaughter of Joseph, the grandson who played the violin, and her son Kenneth. And they pretty much carry on his legacy. They have the Fredrick Douglas Legacy Project, which they are actually speaking out against modern-day human trafficking. And then we had the pleasure to interact with and engage the great nieces of Miss Anna Marie Douglas, who's still on the Eastern Shore. And we do have some Baileys. And what's fascinating about Mr. Douglas, he changed his name to Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, to Frederick Johnson, to Frederick Douglas. So you still have the Baileys that still stay on the Eastern Shore. Any other questions?